to be talking about just how mature surface strip coal mine land rehabilitation planning is in South Africa and Australia. And I'm presenting on behalf of 4 authors. It's myself, then Professor Weyer, both of us are from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, then Professor Alex Lechner, who is from the University of Lincoln in the UK, and soon to be Corinne Unger, who is finalising her PhD through the Business School at the University of Queensland. So just some background. The presentation is based on the first paper that came from my PhD, and my PhD was conferred last year in 2020, but it had its origins in Australia at the Sustainable Minerals Institute where I started. And it was supervised by Professor David Mulligan at that time. And I had to go back to South Africa. So the PhD was then transferred from the SMI to the University of Pretoria. And then Professor Wayne Truter took over the supervision. And I had a third supervisor who was Professor Tim O'Connor, who's with the South African Environmental Observation Network in South Africa. Funding was from the University of Pretoria and from the Caltech Research Association, which is your equivalent of ACOP in Australia. So just what sparked my interest for the research is that I've always been very fascinated with natural systems and thinking what makes them tick. Why is everything so balanced? And I realized there are quite a lot of natural systems which have all these complex relationships, and they drive one another, they influence one another, and they self-correct. And it keeps things harmonious and in balance. But man has come into this picture and he started to use your land use. And man hasn't quite learned, how to balance things, how to live with nature. Hopefully at some time we will evolve and we'll get to that point. And just with these activities, it can have disastrous consequences. So one of those is your land transformation. And we know that more than 50% of the Earth's land surface has been cleared by humans already. And just in Australia, some stats, 12% clearance of native vegetation. In South Africa, 16% clearance of your native vegetation. And then one area in the Karkloof, which actually formed part of my MSc degree, and the paper was written on this, lost 54% of native grassland. So it's a small catchment in South Africa. The yellow is your grassland. 50 years later, this is what it looks like. So big loss of grassland, and your plantations came in, which are the red, and agricultural cropping, which is orange. Your indigenous forest didn't change that much, but a big change. So it got me to thinking, if this is happening on a really small scale in one part of the world, what is it going to be happening and looking like in other parts of the world? And what on earth are we doing to our world and changing things? What are the consequences? Then in terms of mining, mining is highly destructive. So that's what got me interested in that. And you're losing high potential agricultural land. Your soils are getting degraded. You've got threats to food security, to your water, to your biodiversity. And you've got land competition between different land uses. So my thinking was, if you could understand that situation with your mining better, and you could find solutions for that, which is such a degraded state, then you could apply that to other degraded land and hopefully restore land and improve the situation on a global scale. So the question for the paper was, is the harmonious balance of your natural systems, i.e. that first slide that I showed you, is it being considered in your surface strip coal mine land rehabilitation, and to what extent? And normally at the start of mining, you get specialists and they go and they gather a lot of data. There's a lot of work put into that, but then that data just goes into a report. It doesn't really get analyzed. It doesn't get integrated, and it's not normally quantified, and they don't really focus on rehabilitation risk. All they're thinking about is impacts. And you've got your good practice guidelines, which call for risk assessment. But again, like it doesn't say the level of detail, and it's probably being conducted at a very basic level. So we wanted to substantiate that, and just to get a better understanding whether this is actually happening and to what extent. So we went along the routes of a maturity model, and we customized it to review your mine rehabilitation guidelines that are out there and your consultant approval reports. And the objective was to see how mature they were. And it was based on a culture ladder by Hudson. And Corinne Unger also used that for her abandoned mine rehabilitation program. And in the leading practice sustainability program risk management guidelines, it was also used. So our maturity model, it looked like this, and it had its performance indicators going across the top from vulnerable all the way to resilient. And we stated what was meant by each one of those, i.e. vulnerable, inadequate consideration with no data gathered at all. And then resilient, the big things to remember about that was that integration was happening. There was more detailed rehabilitation planning, risk determination was included, and probably data was being quantified. We were starting to get some quantification, not just subjective comments. Then the environmental domain criteria going down. So for each one of those, we went and we stated what was vulnerable for them, what was adequate, what was resilient. And then for the documents, we would score 1 for vulnerable for all of those categories, or 2 for adequate, 3 for resilient, and then we used the intermediate figures for 1.5 and then 2.5 between the categories. So in terms of the reports that we looked at, there were 30 in total. So 14 mine approval reports, 6 after mine approval or progressive rehabilitation reports. And note for this, there were none for South Africa because progressive rehab reports are actually quite hard to come by in South Africa. And there are not a lot of them around when you do find them. And then we also looked at 10 mine rehabilitation guidelines, and 3 were coal mining specific, 7 were general. So again, the reports were chosen to be in the public domain, and that was because of confidentiality constraints and just liability. So the results for your mine approval reports for South Africa and Australia. South Africa scored higher, 1.74. In Australia, South Africa was focused on geology, soils, hydrology, so mainly a focus on contamination prevention, then land use. Australia, big focus on contamination prevention. Then mine approval reports, Queensland versus New South Wales. New South Wales scored higher than Queensland. And Queensland had a focus on contamination prevention, then your landform and your substrate establishment. So focusing on erosion, and probably because the soils in the Bowen Basin are often prone to soil erosion. And New South Wales, the focus was on contamination. Then looking at your mine approval versus your after mine approval reports. In other words, are progressive rehab reports having the detail in them that you're looking for? And for this, the mine approval reports scored higher, 1.6, compared to your progressive rehabilitation reports, which got 1.46. So that was quite surprising for us. Then looking at your mine rehabilitation guidelines, South Africa versus Australia. Australia were way higher, 1.8, South Africa 1.59. And the highest scoring document was the one on the left, which is a technical guideline for the environmental management and exploration of mining in Queensland. So that scored 2.14. And in Australia, the common mine rehabilitation guidelines are your leading practice sustainability development program. And just on that one, the earlier guidelines scored higher at 1.79 compared to the latter one that was published in 2016. Then the last results were your mine rehabilitation guidelines versus your approval reports. So trying to see whether these matched, how much detail was coming out of your guidelines into your reports. And they were quite similar, 1.69 versus 1.67. So just to summarize those points, all the approval reports and the guidelines came out as vulnerable to adequate, not yet resilient. So limited analysis, integration, and quantification of your natural systems. And the approval documents always focus on impacts, not on risk assessment. And just the wording in the reports were very generic. So they were management, objective, and target focused. So they would say, we must ensure that erosion doesn't happen in such an area, but they didn't say how, and they didn't quantify the risks for that erosion. And then some technical guidelines exist, and they're way more detailed than your general guidelines, but there are not many of these around. And then your guidelines are arranged into your life of mine sections, and they're not focused on your environmental domains and your systems. And as I said, your progressive rehab reports declined in detail, and they didn't increase, which we were expecting. The earlier guidelines had more detail than the latter guidelines. So what's driving this? Legislation plays a big role. So risk assessment is stipulated in your legislation in both South Africa and Australia, but they don't say how detailed it should be at the start. And the authorities rely on progressive rehabilitation to fill those gaps, which is not happening. And then they don't state how you should do your risk assessment. So those tools are just not there. The consultants are willing, but they don't know how to do it. Then liability, so they just don't want to commit in documents. So they will make statements very, very vague because of that reason. And then lastly, temporal dynamic nature of mining. So can you plan 50 years ahead? So we felt it is beneficial to plan ahead because you can save costs and make better decisions. You can make minerals more sustainable. So it is worth it. And we propose a framework and a model, and then they must be able to integrate and analyze and quantify your data. And they should be able to almost rank mine sites in terms of their low risk for development and high risks for development based on their rehabilitation profiles. And we proposed a proof of concept model, soil compaction, to see how this would work or what could be done. So the progress, as the third paper from my PhD, we did do the framework, it was developed, and we created a model for soil compaction and used Bayesian networks. And the red highlighted sections are the sections, the statistics for that particular site. And when you applied that, it could calculate that there was a 75% risk of rehabilitation failure for soils compaction. So that's the soils domain. And there is a great paper, if you want to look at that, I can email it to people if you're interested in it. And again, multiple authors from South Africa and from Australia. And the idea is to develop a whole lot of models, not just soil compaction, but also looking at erosion, spontaneous combustion, various models from different domains. You know, you've got your water domain, your soils domain, and your vegetation domain, and picking those models which the mining industry would be interested in. And just on that, we're wanting to also make it applicable to agriculture as well, because many of those risks pertain to agriculture. For instance, soil compaction is common to mining and it's common to agriculture. So it would be great if you could develop some sort of Bayesian network model that you could use in both those industries. So there is a website that has been set up. The link is there, and that's my email address. And we're wanting to create cross-continent research projects. So South Africa and Australia for your Southern Hemisphere mining countries. And then we're also wanting to do one for New Zealand. And bearing in mind, New Zealand's got very unique criteria for the landscapes. And then Canada would be your Northern Hemisphere country, which we're wanting to also develop models for. And just because you've got different climate constraints and things happening there. So it would be really interesting to see how they would work. And something that would be beneficial for the mining industry, you know, tools that could be used to quantify your risks of rehabilitation. So a big thank you to the organizers for allowing the virtual option, because it's meant that someone like us from here in South Africa has been able to partake in such a great conference all the way in Darwin. So we're very, very honored and privileged to be able to do this. Thank you very much.